Hello, folks. This is Dr. Shingima Vima, and today we are talking about the transatlantic slave trade. So, the transatlantic slave trade, for its magnitude as a phenomenon in contemporary, not contemporary, but in modern human history, a lot of scholarship has been done and continues to be done about it as is needed. So, for the purpose of this video and this series, we are looking particularly at where the enslaved people came from, right? Which parts of Africa, ways in which they were brought into enslavement. Then sort of do a broad sweep of some of the lasting effects of the slave trade. So I emphasize this to say this is not a lecture on the nature of slavery in the U.S. or in the islands, if you will. There are other scholars who focus on that, and I can possibly drop them below the video if I find the relevant links. Some of them are my peers. So, but this is just focusing particularly as part of an African history class. It is focusing particularly on the way in which things happened on the continent that got us to the slave trade and some of the lasting impacts on the continent as well. This is not to suggest that the struggles are separate or, this is worse or that is worse. Not at all. Ultimately, when it comes to enslavement, the people who were taken into slavery suffered the most, such that their descendants continue to feel those effects in the New World, so to speak. But there were also some devastating effects on the continent. And of course, later on, much of the continent would be colonized and would suffer at the hands of Western imperialism. I say that all as a disclaimer to sort of, when you see things that may be missing, charge it to that, I'll also add that this is an entry-level sort of class or lecture series. So this may, so charge it to that. It may not have the nuances of a conference style presentation, for example. This is just sort of to get us acclimated with this topic. All that said, let me say I have one more disclaimer before I get right into it. And that is to say, African history obviously does not begin with enslavement. Obviously not. I only say that because this video is coming pretty early on in my series. So some folks may ask why I haven't spoken about ancient Ghana, the Songhai Empire, Aksum, ancient Egypt, and these things. And the reason for that is more pragmatic than it is historical, and that is because this video is needed for other purposes immediately. That said, I will put links as well to videos from colleagues who deal with the history of Africa preceding the slave trade. And as I get around to making my own as well, I'll be sure to place those within, below the video as well. That said, let's get going. So we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade today. And as I've explained it, so let me share my PowerPoint that we can walk through together. All right. So sorry about that. Okay. What is going on here? All right, bravo. Give me one moment. Perfect. Okay, now we're cooking with gas. Or maybe not. Oh, there we go. So we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. These names that the vile really trade has gotten over the years. So let's talk about a very important institution that preceded the transatlantic slave trade, and that is the trans-Saharan slave trade. What is the trans-Saharan slave trade? Well, the trans-Saharan slave trade had been happening for at least 1,500 years, 1,100 to 1,500 years, right? And it was necessitated in large part by the establishment of Muslim communities in Northern Africa, the Arabization of Northern Africa. Why is that important? Well, and bear in mind, Islam comes around in the 7th century, right? Then in time, it asserts itself within Northern Africa, this territory here. And why is that important? Well, religiously, as part of Islamic expansion, religiously they could not. It is against the religion to enslave other Muslims, right? So what does that mean? Since most of the communities in time in North Africa were Muslim in faith, where were they going to get the numbers from? Well, they had to look down into sub-Saharan Africa for people to come into enslavement. So that's where, then add that to the fact of the growth of Ghana and the mines in Ghana and sort of that region in Northwest Africa coming under the control of Muslim kings, right? And the need to extract the resources, gold and the likes in this region, ended up leading to a massive slave trade where folks were captured from the sub-Saharan Africa into this region. And the numbers, they look very, they look large. It's 5 million people over 11 centuries, at least 11 centuries. But that's 1,100 years, right? 11 centuries is 1,100 years. And 5 million people are a lot, but they also come down to 4,000, 5,000 a year for it to work out, closer to 4,000 a year for it to work out that that 5 million people taken over 1,100 years. So why is that important? Well, that's still a lot of people, 4,000 people being taken into slavery every year for over 1,100 years. But we will talk about why that pales in comparison to what became the transatlantic slave trade in a little bit. Remember that number, 5 million people in 1,100 years, which amounts to around 4,000 people a year, if my math serves me right. And what is important to understand as well is now, this is not an attempt to sanitize slavery, the trans-Saharan slave trade at all, but it is just important to show you scope, right? It is important to show you the scope to bring attention to the scope of the transatlantic slave trade when we start talking about it. So this was not plantation slavery, right? It was not. The plantation becomes the definitive institution of transatlantic slave trade in size, in the amount of work and the brutality of it, and the fact that people were born into it just to work the plantation, right? So this was not plantation slavery. A lot of people who were taken into slavery, the males would typically join the army, and many of them would convert to Islam and sort of become initiated into the society that had initially enslaved them. These would typically be people who were brought in by way of conquest. The women would usually become servants in the homes or become concubines to the men of the household. So these are some of the dynamics of the trans-Saharan slave trade, right, which lasted right up until until the 19th century or so. And just to show the nature of this, some of the people who had been enslaved in the trans-Saharan slave trade ended up rising up and taking powerful office in their North African and even Western Asian communities. So it just shows that it was a different form of enslavement. It wasn't that sort of chattel slavery where you are enslaved and sold at the market, then are brutalized throughout your life and sold from owner to owner, and your children are born into slavery as well. It was different. It had its own brutalities, but it was different and very different in scope. So that's the institution that precedes the transatlantic slave trade. All right, so remove my graphic here. So to understand how we get into the transatlantic slave trade, we need to talk about the fact that for 700 years prior to the age of exploration, as it's called, of European exploration, I must say, the Iberian Peninsula, which constitutes Spain and Portugal, had been under the rule of the Moors, right? These are North African Muslims who, in many ways, helped civilize the Iberian Peninsula and by proxy civilize Europe, right? Introducing concepts such as algebra, concepts such as some of the physics and chemistry. The number 0 actually comes in by way of this conquest, and several other things, right? That we can talk about. And I have other lectures dedicated to that that I'll be making in the future, almost retroactively. So I'll make sure you get those as well. But in any case, so the big thing, so the at the end of that, so that's from 700 to around 1400, when to the 15th century, indeed, when the age of Moor rule in Iberia comes to an end, which coincides with the beginning of the age of exploration, out of which the likes of Christopher Columbus come. So the Portuguese, a much smaller economy compared to its neighbors at the time, was eager to get out there and find resources and sort of enrich itself as an empire. So they began to try get to India. You know how this goes, but try to get to India. And as they try to do so by way of the south, I mean, by the way of around the west coast of Africa, they were immediately drawn in by the resources of Ghana and other places like that, gold, among other things. So they started to set up shop hereabouts, okay? This is all in the 15th century, that's in the 1400s. Then in 1480, they discovered the islands of Sao Tome and Principe. Sao Tome and Principe, which are, the islands are within this red box here. They're tiny, but they are within this red box here, of Sao Tome and Principe. And that's in 1480. And they were uninhabited, by the way. So, and they had these rich volcanic sands. And the Portuguese realized that they could make good use of this for agricultural purposes, very rich agricultural soil. But how are they going to do this? Well, so they in 1480, begin capturing, enslaving people, right? From Senegambia, right? From Senegambia, just from across West Africa, and brought them in to serve as and this is Sao Tome is beautiful. So this is a picture of one of the beaches there. But they bring them in, and by the thousands, people who are captured and enslaved are taken to the islands here in Sao Tome and Principe to work, right? And what you're looking at here in this image is what is called Elmina Castle, which was Elmina, sort of, translates to the mine castle in Ghana, still standing in Ghana today, which was the first fortress set up by slave traders in Africa, by European slave traders in Africa. Okay, established in 1482. The first European slave trading post in sub-Saharan Africa by the Portuguese. So why is this important? So they start farming sugar in Sao Tome and Principe, and by the 16th century, which is the 1500s, remember I said this starts in 1480. By the 1500s, it is the biggest sugar market in the world. The biggest sugar market in the world. So, and it is not only significant because it gets this idea of Europeans enslaving Africans going, it also provides the blueprint for what? For slavery in the Americas and the Caribbean, plantation slavery. Why? Because the climate, the tropical climate and the island nature of Sao Tome and Principe is very much like Cuba, very much like Jamaica, very much like Haiti. So it provides that blueprint. It's the first time we dabble with this idea of plantation slavery. And it's the Portuguese who get that started. In fact, they would go on to run Elmina until, I believe, 1637, at which point it was taken over by the Dutch. And the fact that the Dutch and other countries entered the slave trade as well is a very important departure that we'll touch on shortly. So that happens. That is the first instance of people being enslaved by Europeans, but they're still working off the coast of West Africa. Now, at the early part of the 16th century, the early 1500s, people were enslaved and taken from the Senegambia region into plantations in Iberia, right? Into plantations in Spain and Portugal. Well, shortly, what happens is something important happens between the late 1400s, when this was happening, where people were being enslaved and taken into slavery in Iberia, and the move to, and something happens that changes that. And that thing is the quote unquote discovery of the Americas by Columbus and the likes, 1492. I say discovery because, by now we should need no explaining that, it's not a discovery if other people were already there. And not to mention that there's been some pretty good evidence that other groups of people had gotten there before Columbus did, right? So that's neither here nor there. But that discovery, bear in mind that they already have a blueprint from Sao Tome and Principe, and they discover this land. I say discover, but they see the potential for farming sugar and tobacco and these things in these tropical places, cotton, in the Americas. That's the fundamental change, when people stop taking enslaving people into Europe and started focusing primarily on enslaving them into the Americas, right? So initially, the first people who came, as the Portuguese set up shop as the Western Europeans, the Portuguese and soon others set up shop in the Caribbean, they initially tried to enslave the natives, right? We call them Amerindians, or the Native American populations. And this was disastrous for several reasons. First of all, 90% of the Amerindians were wiped out due to the very violent nature of European conquest, right? Very violent nature of European conquest, guns and these things. So most of them died that way. That's one reason. The second reason is diseases, right? Bear in mind that for a long time now, going thousands of years, Africa, Asia, and Europe are in close proximity, such that the people had been in interaction for a long time. But the Americas are so distinctly apart from the rest of the world, and so is Australia and the islands on the other side, that they would not have come into contact with these folks, with uh, the Western Europeans in the way that the Africans had. So any communicable diseases would be fatal when introduced to the societies. So 90% of them were wiped out. Then also bear in mind that these folks are very familiar with the landscape, right? So even resistance, things like escaping or insurgencies were so much easier, not so much easier, but were more regularly organized because the what remained of the local people were able to uh, to to resist in a more effective way, being familiar with the space. So that was the first group. The other group that they tried to put to work, and this was in limited numbers. This is not to say there was a lot of Europeans enslaved as well, which is a strawman argument that some people try to use to diminish the impact of slavery on the Black community. Brought in small numbers as well from Europe, right? And these are people who were criminals and outcasts who were brought in from Europe to work the land, sort of as a penal colony, colonies. And not only were the numbers so small that the impact was negligible, but also if the Native American populations had been wiped away because of diseases that they had not been exposed to before, a lot of the criminals and outcasts were wiped away by tropical diseases, which they would also been unfamiliar to due to the tropical climates of the Caribbean, right? So they were wiped away by these tropical conditions, which again, remember, much of West Africa falls within the tropical region. So, foreshadowing, right? And also, finally, the other reason why that wouldn't work out is, criminals and outcasts are, and I don't mean to paint them with a broad brushstroke, especially understanding what we understand about the incarceration system now. But back then, these are rogues and never do wells, right? So they are probably not the people you want to task with doing honest work for on that scale. So it just didn't work out. Turn now to, so what are they going to do? Where are they going to find the beasts of burden, right, as they would describe them in their very patronizing and racist ways? Well, West Africa would, sub-Saharan Africa for the most part, emerged as an ideal candidate because, one, Africans had long been in interaction with Europeans prior to even Sao Tome and Principe, right? They had been long. There's a long tradition of interaction, so they knew them already. They knew that the Europeans knew that the diseases that had wiped away the Amerindians would not have such an impact on people there, on these groups of people that they'd been interacting with for centuries. They also knew that because they did not know the terrain as well as the remaining Native Americans, chances are they will be easier to rein in, if you will. Then of course they were also not. They were also used to the tropical conditions similar in the islands as opposed to the criminals and outcasts that have been brought in from Europe. So all this points to the reasons why the Europeans then decided to start enslaving people from Africa. And the first set of African captives that were taken across the Atlantic to the Americas was in 1532. 1532 is the first year that Africans land across the Atlantic for the purposes of the transatlantic slave trade. In all this, so for the first 100 years or so, it was numbers remain small, a couple thousand people a year, and we may talk a little more about that in the future slides. But then it booms as we went forward, and I think I touched on that on a future slide. So let's see if we have it here. Okay. In any case, if I don't end up coming back to it, I think it's important to know that in that first century, from 1532 onwards, a couple thousand people a year. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, by the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the numbers were through the roof, right? Almost 100,000 people a year going off into enslavement. Why is that important? Remember that number we spoke about at the beginning with the Trans-Saharan slave trade of like 4,000 people a year, which is not good as far as people going into slavery goes. But you'll see how much it pales in comparison to 100,000 people a year. And not just 100,000 people a year, but 100,000 people going into a far more brutal, dehumanizing system of enslavement, right? So that's why I was talking about that. In any case, so how do we know what we know about the transatlantic slave trade? So, you know, several personalities at the time wrote books. One of the more famous one is Olaudah Equiano, who put out the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, which is an autobiography first published in 1789. This gentleman, brilliant scholar and writer, who had come from Igbo land, we call Igbo land, which is in modern day Nigeria, wrote extensively about that, and soon became one of the chief activists against for the abolition of slavery as an institution. So we have narratives like that, and he's not the only one. Then we also have numerous records of auctions and plantation record books found in the Americas and the Caribbean. Many of the things have since been destroyed. I have a colleague of mine, Dr. Rick Stevenson, who does work where he goes to the seabeds to see what he can find in the slave ships that lay at the bottom of the sea now. So there's a lot of people doing this work, and as I find it, I'll be sharing that as well. But conservative estimates have it that 10 million Africans landed in the Americas alive, and 2 million died during the journey. So that's a number of 12 million. But some estimates have it up to 20 million people, right? So this was a very brutal institution for years and years, millions and millions of people. Now think about those numbers: 10 million plus 12 million people in a period of 250 years, right? And compare that with that 5 million over 1,100 years. Again, the idea is not to negate or to minimize the pain of that first group, but you can tell how much of a behemoth this particular institution became. And we'll talk a little more about it in the following slides. And what I'll do as well is any links related to what I'm talking about that for example, here I have a video that highlights the life of Olaudah Equiano. I just find some of these things on YouTube, and from the art from scholars who have written about these things as well. I'll be putting all those links in the below the video. So what about let's talk about the African dimension. So we said that people who were enslaved into Sao Tome and Principe in the late 1400s mainly came from Ghana and that area which is closest to Sao Tome on the mainland. Then when people started being taken into Iberia, into Portugal and Spain, that was in Senegambia. And that was also the initial site of capture in the 1500s. The initial site of capture for enslaved people who were taken into the Americas, right? And that's the Portuguese initially. Then by the 1500s, the Dutch, the French, the English, the Danish, and other Europeans got more and more involved. The Spanish got more and more involved in the in the slave trade. So they found other spots along the coastline, right? So there's the Angolan coastline, as well as the Slave Coast, which is in Nigeria, and then the Gold Coast is Ghana. So these are all became spots where people were taken into enslavement as well. 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 people at a time being captured into these places. So how were these people enslaved? This is very interesting. How were the people enslaved? Well, the traders who got into this, right, were not military people, and they did not have the numbers, right, to wage war themselves. So what they did, right, was a combination of two things. First of all, trickery, right? Prying on the old institution of Trans-Saharan slavery and other African forms of other existent forms of servitude and slavery, where people might be conquered in war, right? Rival conquest in wars among the different African ethnic groups and states. And these people would work as would be enslaved by these communities. Well, so they pried on that and making deals with the kings, often misleading them into believing that, you know, these folks were going into a servitude, not unlike that was used to on the continent. So that was the first thing. Then the other thing is they pried on the very real, I don't want to romanticize and sort of remove the agency of the kings who sold people into enslavement, right? A lot of the people, you know, people have been power hungry, people have been greedy. So a lot of the kings were really just self-serving by selling, by making a good profit in agreeing sort of these deals with the devil by selling other Africans into enslavement in the Americas. Now, so the traders typically would just build a fort. You know, they did not get inland like that. They would just build a fort on the coast through which, you know, we saw Elmina Castle earlier, through which, you know, local kings and the like would enslave people, and that would be the sort of the passageway to the ships. So to maximize that, right? Because bear in mind that these communities, these kings, were not going out historically to find people to enslave. It will be conquest about other things that people fight for, resources and growing your state. And after the war was done, the vanquished might serve in the military or as servants or slaves to the king, to the winning king. People were not going out. So what does that mean? If that is the case, when communities are not expanding territory or in resource competition, that means that for the traders, their commodity is not available. So what do? So they started stirring up inter-ethnic conflict for captors. So they would just antagonize different groups, you know, spreading falsehoods, positing them against each other, divide and conquer, so that they would fight, and the losing group would be enslaved, and that would give them a commodity, if you will. So this is very important to know. You know, we're trying to establish the agency of both the Africans and but the trickery of the Europeans as well in all this. And as time went on, the traders had developed into, they were not just working with the kings anymore. A lot of the kings were not seeing the benefits that they initially thought that this would have. So they started working with mercenary groups, right, who became professional kidnappers by the 18th century. So they were not just working directly with the kings. They were now working with other mercenary bands of different African peoples who were kidnapping other folks and selling them off into slavery. So these are some of the basics of the way in which this trade grew. And I will also post this video here. It's from a CNN, you know, a sort of CNN report where folks, African American folks, are going back to Ghana, among other places on the continent or the West Coast. But Ghana in particular has done a good job of capturing this moment to the Elmina Castle and the experience of walking into the door of no return. And if you've been keeping an eye out on things recently, in December 2009, late 2009, I believe. Was it earlier? In any case, there was a big festival in Ghana, which almost served as a homecoming celebration for the African diaspora. So there are these conversations happening around acknowledging this history and the descendants of these communities taking their place within that narrative. So what is the general impact, not the general, but what is a lot can be said about the impact of the slave trade. And like I said at the beginning, this is focusing more on the impact of the slave trade on the Americas is far more documented. It is not documented enough, but it has been far more documented, right? And we see it in the lived experiences of Black people in the Americas, in the U.S., and as well as other parts of North and South America. It's been depicted in movies, it's been written about in books. But what is not spoken about as much is the impact of the slave trade on the African continent, which often posits the Africans who remain on the continent as the villains who sold their kin into enslavement for their own benefit, but they also suffered a lot by the way of the slave trade. So, first of all, we were talking about the people. So, 15 to 30% of the people who were taken onto the ships were expected to die from disease and malnourishment. So, what does that mean? Well, that means that the enslavers would pack the ships, right? The way you treat produce, that if I buy 30 tomatoes and 2 of them may go bad, so let me buy 40 if I need 35, whatever, that sort of thing. That's how they treated humans. Pack them into these boats that if 15 to 30% die, and we want 100,000, we can't take 100,000 because then we have 70,000. So why don't we take 150,000 so that if 30% die, we are still around 100,000. So so they were expected to die, and they did die. Such percentages. Remember that estimate said 2 million people died on their way there of the 10 million people who made it, and those are again conservative estimates. Now, a further third of those who arrived died within 3 years of arriving. So remember those 10 million people we spoke about? We started off with 12, and 2 million died on their way. Well, a further 3.5 million died within 3 years of arriving. Talk about how treacherous these lived conditions must have been, right? On the continent, it stagnated population growth, particularly along the coast of Africa. Up until then, the world experiences a population boom across the board from the 1500s going onwards, right? There's a population boom in Europe. Asia starts to, the countries like China and the likes start to, get into the early stages of the boom that would lead them to become the biggest countries in the world. As the colonizers settle in America, those populations begin to grow as well. One area that we know had stagnated population growth as far as was recorded was Africa as a whole, but especially Western Africa. And a lot of it is because of these millions of people who are being taken away. Not only does that create a gap within that population, it is also, you have to ask yourself, what sort of people are taken into enslavement, right? Young people, young, strapping men and women. That's who is going to reproduce, right? And grow the population. So without that gap, you just don't have, not only do you lose those numbers, but you also lose the potential children and commerce that would arise from them. So these are some of the things that start to set Africa back. When you look at Africa being behind the curveball right now, these are some of the early things that posited it that way. The other thing was an emphasis on militarism. What do I mean by that? Well, if we look at the armies, if we look at the empires or the states such as Ghana, Songhai, ancient Mali, and even going back further, these communities had armies, they had militants, right? But in capturing people of opposite ethnic groups or tribes, the currency of your society, it makes you hawkish, right? It makes you hawkish. It made the only commodities that the Europeans were now buying from them were enslaved people, which made them which made the leaders very militaristic, and something that many communities to this day still haven't recovered from. So there's this emphasis on militarism where the only viable trade or viable way of doing business was through militarization. And closely tied to that, this destruction of African industry, which is to say that with everything now focused on the military or on capturing people, other industries that had been long developed, such as the textile industry, the mining industry, all these things sort of took the pine oil industry, cocoa in Ghana, all took a back seat, right, to the institution of enslavement. So that destroyed that African industry. Furthermore, you have to think what these kings were getting in return. They would get terrible knockoff goods, such as first of all, they got a lot of rum, alcohol in return, which I love a good drink myself, but it's alcohol, right? It's not a particularly beneficial commodity, if you will. It's not fair trade, not by any means. They also got firearms, right? Which these firearms were obsolete to such an extent that they could not be used to push back against the Europeans, who would always have more advanced weaponry as far as firearms go. But they also allowed, talk about militarism, allowed the elites to subjugate other communities with ease who did not have the guns. Then also they would trade them in with just like trinkets, like cloth, right? So that, you know, when you are now receiving cloth for selling people, not only is that a terrible deal, it also means that you may focus less on your own textile industry. And textile industry is something that West Africa had long been known for. So that destroyed that African industry. And similarly, it froze technological advancements, right? As people left, you know, up until then, technological ingenuity had been happening across the world, right? Africa was making its contributions, Asia was, Europe was as well. But now, not only are you removing the bright and strongest people of these communities, you are also married to this idea of creating a dependent relationship where you only siphon their goods, right? And in this time, the commodity is people, but later it would become the gold and things like that. So it froze technological development in Africa. Then also, this is very important. People don't talk about this enough. It also proliferated racism. What do I mean by that? Well, racism is not new. It's not 500 years old. It is as old as time. But when I say proliferated racism, the very racism that we are still fighting today, it is this. For a long time, when you can see how Africans are depicted in European literature prior to the slave trade, when they were depicted in other parts of the world prior to the slave trade, it is not unlike the way in which these other people would be depicted in other writings as well. They were just depicted as being different, right? These people are different from us. They have funny ways, which in itself is not racist as it is intriguing, right? It's just like, in a world where now we live in a globalized world, so it may not seem that stark to you, but it will be just like, oh, we saw these other people there and they do this and we think that's crazy. They play this instrument and they look like this. This is how the way in which they were portrayed. And you can read extensively the writings of the likes of Ibn Battuta, who had come to Mali, and it describes the streets that he saw there. You can talk about how Mansa Musa made it onto the I think it's a 14th century map of the world, where and they were using like pivotal things to identify different parts of the world. And in talking about West Africa, they had Mansa Musa holding a golden egg. It's a pretty common image. So I'm saying all this to say that prior to this, difference was spoken of not as a sign of inferiority, but as a sign of difference. That's how it was written about. The idea of people being inferior, right, becomes proliferated with the slave trade. Why? Because there needed to be a moral justification for the enslavement of these people. It was important that these African people, these Black people, be portrayed as subhuman to justify enslaving them. It might have been an economic decision, but the moral justification of it had to come from, you cannot treat people this way. You good Christian Western European people cannot treat people this way. Well, are they really people though? That's that conversation, right? And that is something that we still suffer today. And if you watch the video I did earlier on why the Afrocentric idea is important, that's what this is talking about. And stemming from that, the same logic would be used for colonization, that, well, you cannot kill people by the millions. You cannot starve people into a boat by the thousands. You cannot treat people like beasts unless you believe that they are. So today, racism as we understand it, and the justifications that are given to it, they're not as civilized as us and these things, a lot of it can be traced back to the economics of the slave trade, right? And of course, it has continued to proliferate and develop a life of its own. So those are some of the impacts of the slave trade. A lot more, of course, that we can talk about, particularly if we talk about the impact within the colony, within the Americas themselves and other places where these folks were taken to the New World. But these are just a few of them that I want you to ruminate on. So here's so the transatlantic trade is also known as the triangular trade, and that's due to the nature of the very triangular nature of the trading, right? So we can start in Europe, where the Europeans come to Africa with textiles, rum, and manufactured goods to trade with the kings and eventually the kidnappers, right? And obtain thousands and thousands of slaves, of people who were enslaved. And the enslaved people would be taken to the Americas, right? Where they would be enslaved and brutalized, and this goes on for a couple hundred years. Then from the Americas, the folks would pick up sugar, tobacco, and cotton. The Europeans would take up sugar, tobacco, and cotton, and then take it to Europe, right? Where it's a very profitable thing. With those profits, they bring textiles, rum, and manufactured goods back to Africa, and so goes the triangular trade. So That's what we mean when we talk about the triangular trade, as well as the transatlantic trade. And this year, I'll share this in the comments as well. This is a wonderful interactive graphic made for Project 1619, which is commemorating the 400th anniversary of enslaved. They largely agree. There's been some debates on this, that the date could be earlier in the US in particular. But, the 1619 is widely accepted as the day that the first Africans, enslaved Africans, landed in the continental USA. So there's a wonderful New York Times series that I'll share in the comments as well. I mean, in the section below as well. So yes. Sorry about that. What's going on here? Oh. Okay. Cool. All right. So if you are following with me, these are some key takeaways that I would like you to meditate on, right? Think about the chief institution that was the predecessor to the transatlantic slave trade. We spoke about it at length as the institution where 5 million people were enslaved over 1,100 years, right? Remember as well the island nation whose slave colony provided the blueprint, the model for the Americas, discovered by the Portuguese in 1480. This one I feel a little more at liberty to say discovered, even though the continental Africans knew about it, but just because there was nobody there. Why were Africans particularly targeted for enslavement? What made them ideal, if you will? I hate using all these value-laden words for this very brutal system. What made them preferable, quote unquote, to some of the Europeans that had been brought over and to the Native American populations, right? Think about that. 3 areas where captives were taken from into enslavement. 3 areas, right? We spoke about a lot of areas across the western coast of Africa. So just remember some of them. Then also think at length about this 5 lasting impacts of the transatlantic slave trade. 5 lasting impacts of the transatlantic slave trade. And don't limit yourself to the things I spoke about. If you know others as well, if you've studied others as well, Rodney King, not Rodney King, sorry about that. Walter Rodney has a fantastic book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and it's some of the things that it goes into depth about. So if you're interested in further reading, that's a book that I really recommend reading as well. So thank you so much for this, and I will talk to you next time.